Welcome back. This is lesson 4.3, Comic Book Superheroes Plus. In this lesson, I will cover the period of comic book superheroes that is often called Superheroes Plus. By the end of this lesson, you'll have a good understanding of what is meant by the term Superheroes Plus, the importance of this concept for the development of superhero entertainments in film. Here are some of the many comic books that fall into the category of Superheroes Plus. There is a lot of them. What this notion of Superheroes Plus means is that in addition to the superheroes, new titles with supernatural, science fiction, sword and sorcery, and kung fu themes became popular. So titles like Conan the Barbarian from October 1970, The Tomb of Dracula from April 1972, Werewolf by Night from September 1972, and Man-Thing from October 1972. And also Killraven from May 1973, Master of Kung Fu from December 1973, Iron Fist from May 74, and the infamous Howard the Duck from January 1976, and Red Sonja from January 1977. All of these were Marvel titles. Over at DC, there was Swamp Thing from October 1972, The Shadow, October 1973, and Jonah Hex, March 1977. This is the first key point. With these characters, comic books returned to the roots of superheroes in the pulps. This return to the roots of superheroes was an effort to find a broader base of comic book readers than just superhero fans. So in part, it was an attempt by both Marvel and DC to be something more than a superhero comic book company. Superhero comic book sales declined drastically in the 1970s. For instance, Superman went from selling 500,000 copies in 1969 to 137,000 copies by 1982. The story goes that in the mid-1970s, Marvel Comics almost went bankrupt and was only saved from that by the huge success of their comic book version of Star Wars. Here's the second key point. From the early 1970s, the two key superhero comic book publishers were looking for ways to sustain their position as comic book publishers. What this means is that the way these companies had done business was changing. They were finding it harder to sell comic books. And as companies, they still thought of comic books as the core part of their business. So they looked for other ways to sell comic books. But this laid the basis for thinking of other ways to sell superheroes, and eventually over time for comic books to no longer be the core business for selling superheroes. There are a number of factors that impacted comics in the 1970s, and these created problems for DC and Marvel. What caused the decline in readership? Aging baby boomers. Baby boomer readers were getting older. If they still read comics, their tastes were changing, and many read underground comics that were not subject to the comic code and had sexual and political themes. These were seemingly more adult comics, ones that often seemed at odds with superhero comic books. I say seemed because costume superheroes and the anti-establishment types of underground comics had some similarity in that they operated outside of the formal codes of society. It was often unclear just who had authority over superheroes. They were operated outside the jurisdiction of normal civic authority. Superhero comic books and underground comics then had some commonality in not being immediately aligned with authority. We'll come back to that issue in lesson 4.4. There's also a shift in distribution of comic books. For readers to read comics, they had to be able to purchase them. In the 1970s, the magazine business changed, and distributors were more interested in getting more expensive magazines onto newsstands than the cheaper comic books. At the same time, some comic book fans began trading and dealing in comics and began to open businesses. This eventually created different distribution networks and comic book shops. The problem with trying to make superhero films for a long time was the cost of special effects. We'll come back to that point in Module 5. But the special effects for some of these plus characters were cheaper to do, and so several appeared in films. Conan the Barbarian in 1982, Swamp Thing in 1982, Conan the Destroyer 1984, Red Sonja 1985, one of the worst comic book movies ever, Howard the Duck in 1986, and The Shadow in 1994. Some of these characters, like Conan and The Shadow, had origins in the pulps. Although films with a comic book association like Conan the Barbarian were not superhero films per se, they were part of the development of superhero films as the most important venue for superhero entertainments. We'll come back to that again in Modules 5 and 6. Here's a key point. Superhero comic book publishers search for ways to connect with their audiences and their potential audiences. As a significant portion of the audience aged, the publishers had to rethink their approach. This led eventually to the 1986 reboot at DC, and we'll come to that in the next lesson. This lesson has 4 key points. Go back over your notes and the video of the lesson and make sure you have noted these points. Next up, Lesson 4.4, Superhero Apogee, Watchmen, Dark Knight, Returns, and Crisis.